Beware the Red Mirage. I'm Scott Ott, and this episode of Bill Whittle Now is brought to you by the members at BillWhittle.com. And Bill, that is the story from Hawkfish CEO Josh Mendelsohn. This is an organization that was started by Michael Bloomberg, or founded and funded by him. It does work for the DNC as well as for some pro-Joe Biden super PACs. And what they are saying, or what Josh is saying anyway, according to his data, is that it is possible. And by the way, this comes via Axios on HBO, a show that they do on HBO. It's highly likely, it says in this story, that President Trump will appear to have won, potentially in a landslide on election night, even if he ultimately loses when all the votes are counted. Now, Bill, the thrust of the matter is here that because so many Democrats, possibly up to 40% of voters on election night 2020, will vote by mail-in ballot, that all the mail-ins won't be counted by election night. President Trump could look like he won in an electoral landslide that Mendelsohn pegs at 408 to 130 in the Electoral College, if 15% of the mail-in ballots are counted. But within 4 days, 75% of the ballots being counted, Joe Biden flips that and ultimately goes on to win the presidency. Bill, first of all, I mean, it's really hard to evaluate these kind of things that are speculative and theoretical. And immediately you're going to undress this guy because he's hired by Bloomberg and he works for the DNC. But President Trump has been casting all kinds of doubts on the potential for corruption in the outcome of the November election. And now it looks like the other side's doing it as well. Is this good for our republic?
The entire idea of voting, of mail-in votes for an election is the end of democracy as we know it. It's the end of the republic, precisely for the reasons that this article says. First of all, understand that they're not just doing a public service to their readers. They are prepping the battle space. What they are basically saying here is if it turns out that on the end of the night of the election, which is held on election day, that Donald Trump appears to have won, don't let that fool you, because there may be ballot boxes filled with Democratic votes that haven't been counted yet.
Specifically, vote by mail ballots.
Yeah. And who's to say he's wrong? And since we're going to go down this road, why should we stop counting a week after the election or a month? Why don't we just keep counting until Joe Biden is declared the winner? That was the strategy in 2000. They had lost the vote in Florida. They'd lost the count, but by a close enough margin that it triggered another recount. So they did another mechanical recount, and Bush won again, and that was the end of it as far as the law is concerned. But the Democrats have no respect for law, so what they did was they continued to count and count and count and count and count, and then they got into this whole business of hanging chads and dimpled chads, and what was the voter really trying to say with this particular ballot? Let's hold it up with a microscope, or with a magnifying glass, and see if we can determine intent, when in fact, a vote is not an opinion. A vote is an action that has to be accomplished with a certain degree of competence. And if you can't punch a hole in a card successfully and check it, then that's not a vote. So this is exactly what they're doing. They are setting the stage because they know they're going to get shellacked. And this is the reason why Democrats, or at least the modern Democratic Party, does not belong in a republic. It does not belong in a country that is predicated on self-rule, because we can see now they simply do not deserve to live in democracy because they cannot handle the fact that when they lose, they lose. So all of this is predicated on what their position will be come midnight on the first Tuesday in November, when Donald Trump has what I think is going to be a landslide victory. And it is setting people up for the fact that, oh, well, yes, we all knew that it was going to be a big Trump win on the night of the election. But now Trump is going to be suppressing all of these other votes that were legitimately mailed in, and the great orange dictator continues his diabolical rule, and that's the narrative, and they're sticking to it.
Bill, it seems to me that you and President Trump both have a partisan blind spot. In effect, you're challenging the other side for delegitimizing the election in advance, while President Trump's been doing the same thing for weeks, basically saying if the Democrats win, if Joe Biden wins, therefore it was corrupt. It's a kind of this ipso facto argument. You will know whether the election was corrupt or not, depending on who wins. Biden wins, corrupt. Trump wins, the legitimate voice of the American people. How is this good for the legitimacy of an election process, no matter how you cast your ballots?
It's terrible, Scott. It's the end of everything. It is the election, the 2000 election was the first time that the legitimate outcome of an election was called into question by a major party, and they never stopped doing it. The Democrats could not accept the fact that George Bush won in Florida, and for the remainder of his 8-year term, they never, ever let it die. You could make a very compelling case that the 1960 election was stolen by John Kennedy. There's a fair amount of evidence to indicate that was the case. But Richard Nixon decided that rather than see the country come apart, he decided that, okay, well, we'll just concede the fact that we lost, even though it was widely known that there was widespread corruption, especially in Chicago and so on. So in 2000, the Democratic Party decided that rather than accept the loss, they would challenge the entire legitimacy of the election, which they have continued to do and which they're doing now. So I disagree with the president when he says, if I lose, that means that it was corrupt. But I do think what President Trump should be saying on a daily basis is that the reason we have an election day is precisely so that everybody can have some reasonable trust that this election was carried out legitimately.
Bill, that hasn't happened for a long time. We've had early voting. We've had absentee ballots for a long time.
When did early voting become...
that we're all gathering together in the middle of the town square and, vocally expressing our support for one candidate or the other is an artifact of the early 1800s.
Absolutely
it's not just
false.
one election day.
Absolutely false. 100% false. Absentee balloting has been with us from the beginning of the Republic, and rightfully so. But absentee ballots have never determined the course of an election. And I'm not 100% sure of this, but I think they need to be in there by a certain time. And it's not just this open-ended thing. Obviously, you can't vote for the president 2.5 years after the election. And so absentee balloting is not the same as open voting. It's not the same as mail-in voting. It's not the same as any of this stuff. Absentee balloting was a specific condition that had a very specific set of requirements in order to be met. You had to be out of the country. You had to have a legitimate reason why you were not able to vote in person. And because that applied to only a small percentage of Americans, the risk was exceedingly small. And besides, the procedure was well accounted for.
I voted absentee when I was at college.
Hold on. It was the Democrats, starting with Barack Obama, that started to advertise this idea of why wait until Election Day? Why not vote a month in advance? Why not have voting a month in advance, a year in advance? Why not start voting now? Why not vote as often and as frequently as you can? Why not vote in as many states as you can possibly get away with? It was the Democrats under Barack Obama that understood that in order to get their policies past the American people, they could never do it in a legitimate election. And so they started talking about things like this, open voting, and we'll start voting a month before the election. What difference does it make? Just mail it in. We'll count it. Don't you worry. And then they started their procedure of making sure that people who would not otherwise be able to vote could vote. Illegal immigrants, no requirements for voter ID, no requirements for cleaning out the voter rolls. These are all Democratic, all of them are Democratic Party policies designed to enable fraud in the voting system. And so there you go. I didn't create the history. I just report it. And that's the way it happened.
Well, of course, the Democrats would argue that they're not designed to enable fraud. They're designed to make it possible for every person to vote and for every vote to be counted. Even those people who, for one reason or another, couldn't get to the voting place on that day. But Bill, the upshot of this show isn't about whether or not mail-in ballots are a good idea. That horse has left the barn. That's already happening. So the question is, what happens on election night when President Trump, if this Red Mirage theory happens to play out the way the Hawkfish CEO says that it's a good chance that it could, what happens when he's got a huge electoral college victory, and then 4 days later, when they get done counting the ballots, which, by the way, had to come in before a certain deadline, just like absentee ballots, that it actually flips over. What do you do then as somebody who was a Trump supporter?
Well, now we know what the ultimate objective of the progressives is. We conservatives believe in an election day, and we believe that if you have a 2-year advance warning, actually, you have a 100-year advance warning, thousands of years of advance warning. You know when elections are going to be in this country. If you can't free 2 or 3 hours a day that you are legally guaranteed to take off from work or wherever you are, if you can't get to a polling place on election day, then you don't deserve to be a citizen. There are exceptions for people who are ill or immobile. Those people can have absentee ballots. That's fine. But this idea of having an open voting season is designed for voter fraud. And the argument that the Democrats use is that, well, we want to count every vote. In fact, we want to count every vote several times if we have to. So they talk about voter
Bill,
suppression.
in fairness, that's your sarcastic take on it. That is not the argument that the Democrats are making.
It's not my sarcastic take on it. An election day is an election day.
Standing up and making the argument that we want to count votes multiple times. Nobody's saying.
Then fine. If that is exactly their position, if a Democrat is saying, no, we don't want to count votes multiple times, then why don't we do it the way they do it in any other third world country? Why don't we go down to the voting place, to the polling place, and when we vote, we dip our fingers in indelible ink, just like they do in the third world, to try to guarantee some kind of legitimacy to the vote. I'd be 100% in favor of that. Paper ballots, and if it takes another 10 hours or 10 days to count them, I don't care. You go down there, you vote, you hand in your ballot, you put your finger in the ink, and then somebody sits in every other polling place and looks for ink on the fingers. But that's not what they want. That is not what they want. It's what we want. And we want ID. And we want identification. If you have to buy a pack of cigarettes at a 7-Eleven and produce ID, or if you have to buy a 6-pack of beer and produce an ID, it doesn't strike me as unreasonable that you should have to produce an ID to say that you're the person on that list that's going to determine the future of this country, its citizenship, and the rest of the world. That is not an outrageous burden to put on the American people, and to say it is another form of racism on the part of the Democrats. It's saying that black people, or whoever they want to make into the victims of this, are incapable of getting to a polling station once every 2 years. It's ridiculous.
Well, again, you're arguing against a legitimate process that's already been legally put in place.
It's not a legitimate process.
You may call it illegitimate, Bill, but it hasn't been passed illegally in the states where it's being used.
Mail-in voting is going to result in the kind of riots that we've not seen in this country since the Civil War, and that's going to happen one way or another in this November.
Isn't it true that it's going to happen one way or another, no matter who wins in a close election? Both sides, the loser side is always going to claim that it was nothing but corruption that caused them to lose.
That's right.
And that this country is a disaster because those people are in charge.
That is precisely the goal that the progressives had in mind when they eliminated the entire idea of an election day. Now, they can claim with their buddies in the media, with their audiovisual department, they can claim, well, yeah, sure, he won the vote according to the ones that were counted, but we all know how rigged the system is. And what about all of those mail-in votes that never showed up, that Trump must have taken and dumped in the river? You see how this works? You see how easy it is?
Yeah, what I see is that everybody calls everybody else a liar, and there's not a single person on either party who is saying, look, we have the best system that we've been able to come up with. We'll put good measures in place to count these votes. These are handled by local election officials who are accountable to their voters. Why not say, let's keep an eye on these people, but not challenge the legitimacy of the vote before we even know who got elected?
We have, in this country, for 250 years, a reliable and accurate way to determine with very small margin of error who actually was elected in this country. And that process involves citizens going to a polling place that is observed by observers on election day and casting a paper ballot that they have registered for so that they can have their name checked off of a list when they put that ballot into the container, which is then taken by people of both parties, Republicans and Democrats, march it down to the counting center, and they watch them count the votes. That is essentially an incorruptible system, and it has served us very well for 250 years or so. And because it served us so well, it had to be destroyed. because
It was in-person paper balloting in the year 2000. Bill, the election that you just damned as being a corrupt mess was in-person paper balloting on those little punch cards.
Correct, exactly correct. And there begins the source of all of our troubles, because a machine counts those paper cards. The machine counts the holes. The machine, it's not a computer. It's not programmable in that way. It is a simple mechanical analog device that counts votes when a little sprocket goes through each one of those holes. And if those holes are not punched out, then that vote is invalid. That ballot is invalid. It is not a valid ballot, and it is thrown out. And the thing that counts the holes in the paper doesn't know or care whether it's a Republican ballot or a Democrat ballot. If the holes are not punched, or punched two of them where two candidates are voted for in the same time in the same office, it is discarded. It is a I don't remember what the word is. It's an illegitimate ballot.
Yeah, it's called a disenfranchised voter, right?
No, it's not called a disenfranchised voter. It's called an idiot who cannot function, able to function according to the instructions of a ballot. A vote is a right that is a procedure. It is not an opinion, and it's not a simple statement of how I want things to be. A vote is a civil duty that requires you to accomplish a few steps that are so simple that for people to claim that it somehow disenfranchises people, that is the ultimate form of racism and the ultimate form of insult, to say that somebody is not capable of punching holes in a ballot. The reason that the 2000 election was such a catastrophe is not a result of the paper ballots, because the paper ballots counted George Bush as the winner in Florida. And when they recounted him, they counted George Bush as the winner in Florida. But that wasn't enough for the Democrats. So they continued to do things that should never have been allowed in the first place. This business of hanging chads and determining whether this is a dimpled chad. We want the voters' intent to be determined. Really? Well, if the voters' intent were to be determined the way it's supposed to be determined, then the voter should have punched the holes in the cards the way that he wanted to, and then he should have held it up like he's supposed to and made sure that the holes were punched and that there were no two holes next to each other before he dropped it in the ballot. Once you started taking paper ballots and having people try to determine whether this thing was punched or not, now, all of a sudden, now you are not dealing with the ballot anymore. Now you're dealing with two political parties trying to wrest some kind of a win out of a situation where the nameless machine that is not a program computer ran these cards through and said, George Bush won. Really? Yes, it was close. Run them again. Okay, Bush wins again. Well, that's not acceptable. So what can we do now to make sure that this doesn't happen again? We're going to have electronic voting. Now we're going to have mail-in voting. Now we're going to have a month to vote. Now we're going to have, and now we have already lost it. It's not on its way out. It's lost. It's over. It's done. They've accomplished it. You are absolutely right. No matter who wins in November, nobody's going to trust the outcome, because that is the world that the progressives have created for us. And if they say it's not true, then by God, let's get together on this and form a nonpartisan agreement that we will go down in person and we will put our marks on a ballot. And if somebody's having a problem with the ballot, then they can get help with the ballot. And then when they're finished, they can dip their finger in indelible ink. And then we will know who actually won the election, instead of having these miserable, anti-democratic, monstrous control freaks who cannot get their policies past the American people in a legitimate election. Then we would have an answer to this. But the cheating has been so beautifully set up now that it doesn't matter who wins. It is going to be an illegitimate president for the next 4 years. And that is what their strategy has been, because they know that this fossil that they've elected is got no chance of being elected, and therefore the only way to deal with anything in the future is to continue to delegitimize Donald Trump, which is not about delegitimizing Donald Trump. It's about delegitimizing every single person that voted for Donald Trump. And they can claim voter suppression all they want to, but if one person votes twice, they have suppressed my vote. Voter fraud is voter suppression. And if somebody votes twice and that cancels out my vote and then puts another one on their side, they have stolen my vote. I want my vote to count. I want everybody's vote to count. If we lose this election fairly, we lose the election fairly. But we have always been on the side of rules, and therefore we're chumps who can be taken advantage of.
Final question, quick answer. What do you think are the odds of what Josh Mendelsohn is saying, this Red Mirage scenario on Election Day this year?
I think the chance that that Trump will have large numbers that will then be legitimately overturned by legitimate ballots is about zero. But I think that the scenario that he's painting, that he's prepping people for, that your Democratic vote was stolen because it was mailed in. And yes, Trump won big, but that's not a real win because those were just the people that went down and voted in person. I think that scenario is 100% accurate. And I don't know what is going to happen. I just know it's going to be exceedingly ugly. And my feeling is, my hope is, and really my only hope left is, and certainly there are indications to indicate that this may in fact be the case, is that this election is going to go so overwhelmingly in favor of Donald Trump and the Republicans, not so much because of Trump or the Republicans, but because of what the Democratic Party has become. My feeling is that this is going to be such an overwhelming tide that they will not be able to cheat their way out of it. And if that is the case, then it should be the first responsibility of the president and the Congress to immediately enact voter reform that guarantees every single American citizen the right to vote. And if that means paying for them to get to the voting place, if that means we have to have government paid for buses to get people to polls, I have no problem with that whatsoever. None. Zero. But we had better get this election system sorted out. And the damage that has been done is overwhelming and intentional. And it all began in 2000. And we know who began it, because the machines that count these things using sprockets don't lie. George Bush was the winner in Florida. The Constitution said that since the margin of victory was so narrow, there had to be another mechanical recount, and there was, and he won that, and that was the end of it. But it wasn't. So here we are.
The members of BillWhittle.com have made it possible for us to have these conversations about the breaking news of the day in the context of time-tested principles. If you're the kind of person who enjoys hearing what both sides have to say, not just a talk fest of right-wing talking points with commentators patting themselves on the back, but really engage these issues with the best arguments from both sides, then perhaps you'll join us at BillWhittle.com by clicking that big green Become a Member button. For Bill Whittle, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks for watching.